You are standing at the edge of a salvage yard on Cincinnati's west side, sometime in early October 2022, and the thing you're looking at doesn't make any sense. It's a steel cylinder, maybe 4 feet across, 9 feet long, laid on its side between a gutted HVAC unit and a pile of copper pipe someone already stripped. Stainless steel, brushed silver, still clean enough to catch your reflection. The kind of object that doesn't belong in a junkyard. The kind of thing that looks like it walked off an assembly floor yesterday and fell off a truck somewhere between there and here. There's a hatch on the side, oval, about 18 inches across. Gasket still attached, a little lever latch. Most people walked past it. The salvage guys had it priced at scrap weight, like everything else. They were going to cut it up that week, sell the steel by the pound. Marcus Hale didn't walk past it. He stood there for about 40 minutes, just looking. Opened the hatch, climbed halfway in, knocked on the inner wall with his knuckle, listened to the sound it made, thought about something he'd read years ago in a magazine at a library. A guy in Iowa who turned a water heater into a wood stove and heated his whole garage through a Minnesota winter. Then he asked the salvage man how much. Marcus was 43 that October. He'd been sleeping outside, on and off, for about 14 months, since he lost the apartment on Coleraine Avenue in August of 2021. Before that, he'd worked 11 years at a sheet metal fabrication shop in Blue Ash, cutting and forming ductwork for commercial HVAC systems. He knew how metal behaved. He knew how air moved through an enclosed space and what it took to hold heat inside a box. It wasn't military training. It wasn't an engineering degree. It was 11 years of standing next to machines that bent steel for a living, watching what worked and what didn't. He'd been laid off in February 2021 when the shop lost 2 big contracts and cut the floor crew by half. He was 53rd seniority out of 60 workers. He got 6 months of unemployment, which ran out in August. He had $1,400 in a checking account and a lease that cost $870 a month. He lasted 2 months after the unemployment ended, paid rent in September, couldn't make October, got served a notice in late October, and was out by November 15th. He spent the first 3 months moving between a shelter on Guest Street and a cousin's couch in Norwood. The cousin situation ended in February 2022. Not badly, just awkwardly, the way those things go when 2 people are sharing a 1-bedroom apartment and one of them doesn't pay rent. He went back to the shelter through March and April. By May, he was camping along the Mill Creek Bike Trail, which a lot of people do in Cincinnati when the weather breaks. It's not conspicuous in warm weather. You can stay clean at the YMCA on Central Parkway for $5, eat at the St. Francis Seraph Pantry on Vine Street on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and largely go invisible to everyone. October was when the problem started to become urgent. Not cold yet, not really. But that particular October in Cincinnati had a mean temperature of about 49 SF, and 3 nights it dropped below 35 SF. In a sleeping bag on the ground next to a bike trail, 35 SF isn't survivable as a long-term strategy, not without real protection. He'd made it through one previous winter, 2021 into 2022, with a combination of the Guest Street shelter and the Mill Creek underpass. But the shelter had turned him away twice in March for showing up after the 9 p.m. curfew, and he'd decided he wasn't going to be dependent on someone else's schedule to stay alive. He wanted a place he controlled. He'd thought about a van. Everyone thinks about a van, but a van costs money, needs insurance, needs an address for registration, needs gas, breaks down. He had $340 in a checking account at Fifth Third Bank, and maybe $80 in cash. A van wasn't going to happen. He'd thought about a storage unit, which some people do, but the management watches those places and you get evicted and fined. He'd thought about a lot of things, the way you think about a lot of things when the days are getting shorter and the temperature is falling, and you know what the next 4 months are going to feel like if you don't figure something out. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October 2022, he walked through the gate of Midwest Industrial Salvage on Dalton Avenue to look for pipe fittings, and he saw the tank. The man who ran the salvage yard was named Gerald, and Gerald had owned the place for 19 years and had seen everything come through those gates. He didn't ask what Marcus wanted the tank for. That was one thing about salvage yards. Nobody asks. You want a 500-pound steel cylinder? It's $80 at scrap weight. Help yourself get it out of here. Marcus didn't have a truck. He didn't have a car. He had a flatbed handcart he'd borrowed from a guy he knew near the Millvale neighborhood, and he spent the better part of a Wednesday afternoon rigging a system of rope loops to roll the tank onto the cart and then wheel it, very slowly, 2 miles, along surface streets to the location he'd already identified. The location was a concrete pad behind an empty building on Beekman Street off Spring Grove Avenue, in the Cumminsville neighborhood. The building had been a small machine shop. It closed in 2018 and had been sitting with a for sale sign that nobody ever changed since then. The concrete pad was original to the building, poured maybe in the 1960s, cracked in 3 places, a foot of ragweed growing through it on one edge, not visible from the street because of a 6-foot chain-link fence running along the back of the property. You had to know it was there. Marcus knew it was there because he'd walked every inch of that neighborhood the previous winter looking for dry places to sleep. He'd noted the pad then and filed it away. He got the tank to the pad at about 4 p.m. on that Wednesday, October 5, 2022. He set it down on its side. It was already on its side, and sat with his back against it for a few minutes, catching his breath. The tank was a 10-barrel brewery fermenter. He didn't know that word at the time. He learned it later, after the fact. What he knew was that it was stainless steel, double-walled, with foam insulation sprayed between the inner and outer shells by whoever made it. He knew that because he'd used a pocket knife to probe one of the existing ports on the end cap, and the foam came out tan and dense and slightly springy. The same closed-cell foam they used on commercial duct insulation at his old job. Good foam, the kind that holds heat. The inside diameter was about 46 inches. If you laid flat, you could stretch out almost fully. If you sat up, you had about 3 feet of headroom. The cylindrical section alone, not counting the cone-shaped end, was about 48 inches long, so roughly 4 feet of open floor space. Tight, but workable. Better than a sleeping bag on the ground. The first thing he did was spend 3 days just living in and out of the unmodified tank, sleeping in it at night with the hatch open, getting used to the dimensions, figuring out what he needed. He made a list on the back of a Frisch's Big Boy receipt. Floor platform, wood, the steel floor gets cold. Door seal for the hatch, ventilation, 2 ports, 1 low, 1 high, stove, flue pipe, CO detector. That last one wasn't optional, he knew that. He'd seen a news story years ago about a family in Cleveland that died from carbon monoxide from a generator running in a closed garage. He understood that a fire in a sealed space produces gases that kill you before you know they're there. The detector was not optional. Here's what you need to understand about how a brewery fermenter is built, because it matters for what happened that winter. When a craft brewery orders a fermenter, they're ordering an insulated stainless steel vessel that needs to hold a precise temperature for anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks while the yeast does its work. The manufacturer builds it with that requirement in mind. The inner shell is food-grade stainless, smooth, sanitary, non-porous. The outer shell is thicker stainless, or clad carbon steel. Between those 2 shells, the factory sprays 2 to 3 inches of closed-cell polyurethane foam, the same material used in commercial refrigerated trucks and walk-in coolers. 3 inches of closed-cell polyurethane foam is somewhere around R18 to R21. That's better than a standard 2x4 exterior wall in a house. It's designed to keep beer at 34 FIV inside when the ambient temperature of the brewery is 68 FIV, a 34-degree differential, held passively, with just the foam and the steel. What Marcus was sitting inside, on the concrete pad on Beekman Street, was essentially a walk-in cooler that had been laid on its side. And what a walk-in cooler does, which is just what insulation does, regardless of which direction the temperature is flowing, is hold whatever's inside separate from whatever's outside. Push heat in, the foam holds it. Your own body heat, just sleeping, generates around 250 to 300 BTU per hour. In a 60 cubic foot insulated cavity at R18, that's enough to raise the interior temperature meaningfully above the outside air, even with no other heat source at all. Marcus didn't know the R value number. He just knew the foam was good, and he knew what good foam did. But body heat alone wasn't going to be enough in January, not at -5 at FIF or -8 at FIF. He needed a stove. The water heater came from the same salvage yard, 3 days after the tank. Gerald had 2 of them, both 40-gallon residential units, pulled from a house demo in Westwood. One had a cracked outer shell, the other was intact, just old. The tank itself, the actual steel pressure vessel inside the foam and fiberglass outer casing, was in good shape. Steel walls about 3 to 4 times as thick as a 55-gallon drum, already cylindrical, already had pressure relief valves and pipe fittings in the top. $15. Gerald practically gave it away. Marcus stripped the outer casing with a pry bar, pulled off the fiberglass bats and the foam and the sheet metal jacket until he was down to bare steel. Then he spent an evening at the concrete pad going through the physics of the conversion in his head. The idea, which he'd first read about in a copy of Mother Earth News from January 1978 that he'd found in a box of magazines at a library book sale back in 2009, paid a dime for, read front to back, and apparently never fully forgot, was simple. You lay the water heater on its side. The bottom becomes the door end. You cut a loading hatch in what's now the top face, hinged with an airtight fit. You cut a collar in the back end for a flue pipe. You add a draft control vent low on the front to manage airflow. You set it on legs so air can circulate underneath. The water heater walls were already airtight. That was the key thing. The original article made a specific point about it. A 55-gallon drum stove leaks air through every seam and weld, which means you can't control the burn rate. An old water heater is a sealed pressure vessel. It's built to hold pressure, not just hold water. When you close the draft control and the flue damper, the fire inside chokes down to almost nothing because there's no air feeding it. You get a slow, controlled burn. You get heat that lasts 4 to 6 hours on one load of wood instead of burning hot and fast for 45 minutes. Marcus didn't have a welder. That was the problem with the conversion as written. The original design required welding a flue collar onto the end cap. He spent 2 days thinking about that. What he had was a set of basic hand tools, a reciprocating saw he'd borrowed and then sort of kept from his old shop, a drill, a set of bits, a pry bar, 2 adjustable wrenches, a tube of high-temperature silicone sealant, and a box of sheet metal screws. He also had access to a section of 4-inch galvanized stovepipe that he'd found in the alley behind a house on Dalton Avenue that had just been re-roofed. The stovepipe was 4 inches in diameter. The existing pressure relief valve fitting on the top end of the water heater was 3/4-inch NPT, too small. But there was a 1.5-inch threaded port at the very top end cap, originally for a temperature and pressure relief valve, and right next to it a 2-inch hot water outlet fitting. He drilled both out. Drilled and filed the 2 openings into one ragged but serviceable 4-inch hole, then used a hose clamp, a compression fitting he found in a hardware bin, and half a tube of high-temp silicone to mate the 4-inch stovepipe to the end cap. It wasn't pretty. The silicone cured dark orange and slightly irregular, but he pressurized it, wrapped a rag around the hose connection and hit it with compressed air from a gas station down the block, and it held. For the loading door, he used the reciprocating saw to cut a 10-inch by 12-inch rectangle into the face of the horizontal tank, then used the cutout piece as a door, hinged with 2 bolts and a strip of steel cut from a coffee can. Fire brick from a demolished chimney he found 3 blocks away went inside on the floor of the tank as a heat sink, something to absorb and slowly re-radiate warmth after the fire died down. The legs were scrap 2x4 lumber bolted to the outer casing. He set the stove at a slight angle, about 5 degrees of tilt toward the door end, so ash would fall away from the firebox and toward the ash cleanout he cut near the bottom front. The draft control was a $3 purchase at a plumbing supply on Spring Grove Avenue, a simple 1/4-inch ball valve threaded into a hole he drilled in the door plate. Open it, air feeds in, fire burns hot. Close it down, fire chokes to a slow smolder, heat output drops but duration extends to 6 or 8 hours. Total cost for the stove conversion, around $22 in hardware, plus the $15 water heater and whatever he'd spent borrowing tools. The fire brick was free, the stovepipe was free. Now the shelter itself. Because the stove was only half the problem. You can't just run a stove inside a steel cylinder and call it livable. The cylinder is the fermenter, a 4-foot diameter tube with an oval hatch. The stove goes outside the main sleeping area and vents through it, but the heat has to get in. And you have to be able to breathe. Marcus solved this with what ended up being, and I say this not as a compliment exactly, more as just a plain description of what it was, a genuinely clever arrangement. He positioned the fermenter tank with its hatch facing south, so any winter sun hit the hatch directly. He built a small antechamber off the hatch opening, basically a 3-sided enclosure made from a section of corrugated metal roofing he found at the back of the salvage yard, and 2 panels of 3/4-inch plywood he pulled from a dumpster on Spring Grove. The antechamber was maybe 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, open at the top but covered with a section of sheet metal on a slight angle to shed rain. It wasn't insulated, it wasn't heated, it was just a windbreak, a buffer between the outside air and the fermenter hatch. The stove sat in this antechamber. The flue pipe rose from the back end of the stove, bent at a 45-degree elbow, and ran up through a gap he left in the top of the antechamber covering. The pipe extended about 3 feet above the roofline to give it proper draft. He wrapped the exposed pipe sections in scraps of fiberglass bats from the water heater's outer casing, held on with wire. The heat from the stove radiated into the antechamber. Some of it leaked through the fermenter hatch, which he left intentionally unsealed by about a 1/2 inch, and some radiated through the steel walls of the antechamber enclosure itself. The fermenter tank, with its R18 walls, caught and held whatever heat came through the gap and never let it out. The CO detector, a battery-powered First Alert model he bought at a Dollar General on Hamilton Avenue for $24, went inside the fermenter, zip-tied to the inner wall. He tested it with a lighter, verified it alarmed, replaced the batteries with fresh ones. That was non-negotiable. He also drilled a 3/4-inch hole low on the floor of the antechamber side of the fermenter hatch, and a matching hole high on the opposite end cap of the fermenter, and ran a short length of flexible aluminum dryer duct between them, passive ventilation, low in high out, so the air inside the sleeping chamber turned over slowly without pulling the heat out faster than the stove could replace it. The whole build, from finding the tank on October 5th to moving in on October 22nd, took 17 days. He slept inside for the first time on a Thursday night when the temperature outside dropped to 41 FF. Inside the fermenter, 61 FF, no fire. Just the insulation and his body heat and the ambient warmth that had built up through the day. He lay there for a while with the hatch cracked slightly, listening to traffic on Spring Grove Avenue, not sure whether to be relieved or worried that it had worked that easily. November was a calibration month. He learned the stove's rhythms, how long a load of dry hardwood burned at different draft settings, how quickly the fire brick in the floor of the stove saturated with heat and then gave it back slowly, how much smoke came off wet versus dry wood. The wood supply was a problem he'd anticipated. He spent November weekdays walking a radius of maybe 2 miles around the Beekman Street pad, identifying every tree that had come down in October's wind events, every construction debris pile that had scrap lumber, every alley with a wood-burning fireplace and a cordwood stack that was partially accessible. He wasn't stealing, he was collecting what was already being thrown away. Broken pallets, scrap 2x4s, dead branches cut into 12-inch lengths. He built a covered wood stack along the south fence of the machine shop property, using the corrugated roofing scrap as a lean to cover. He got the stack up to about 1/3 of a cord by mid-November, not enough for the whole winter, but enough to feel real. He also learned the fermenter's one serious weakness, condensation. The inside of the tank stayed warmer than the outside air. His breath was humid. The difference between the warm interior air and the cold steel walls, even through the insulation, created a slow, persistent moisture problem. By the second week, the inner wall of the fermenter had a faint sheen of condensation every morning, not dripping but damp. He woke up once with a sleeping bag that was heavier than it should have been, the outer shell having absorbed enough moisture to feel noticeably wet. He solved this in 2 ways. First, he cut a second ventilation hole, a 1-inch opening low in the hatch panel, covered with a small flap of rubber cut from a bicycle inner tube, so air could come in but wind couldn't blow straight through. Combined with the high exhaust port on the opposite end, this created a slow convective airflow that carried moisture out. Second, he started desiccating his sleeping bag every morning, pulling it out of the hatch, hanging it over the fence in whatever sun there was, then bringing it back in before dark. On cloudy days, he draped it over the stove in the antechamber for 20 minutes, which dried it out completely. By mid-November, he had a system. A friend, another man who camped along the Mill Creek Trail named Darius, who Marcus had known since the previous winter, came by one afternoon and looked at the setup for a long time without saying anything. Then he said something like, "You built that out of what?" And Marcus walked him through it. Darius said he thought the CO detector was a good idea, but that the stovepipe didn't look right. He'd done some roofing work years ago and said the pipe wasn't drawing the way it should. Marcus listened to that seriously. Darius was right more than he was wrong about mechanical things, and spent the following Saturday extending the flue pipe by another 2 feet and adding a rain cap he fashioned from a tin can, which improved the draft noticeably. A low draft means incomplete combustion, which means more carbon monoxide. He had the detector, but he didn't want to rely on it. The detector alarmed once, in early December, during a windless afternoon when he'd overloaded the stove with a large piece of oak that was slightly green. He was outside the hatch when it went off, heard it through the metal, and immediately opened everything up, pulled the stove door fully open to let the fire breathe, and waited 20 minutes before going back inside. The alarm was right. The CO had been building. That was the one moment the whole winter where things could have gone badly, and the detector caught it. He never ran the stove with the hatch fully sealed after that, not even once. December 23, 2022. The National Weather Service called it Winter Storm Elliott. They called it a bomb cyclone, and they said that phrase like it was dramatic, but that morning in Cincinnati, you didn't need anyone to tell you what was happening. The temperature at CVG Airport dropped 52 degrees in 12 hours, a record for the area, the biggest single-day swing they'd ever measured. By 6 a.m. on the 23rd, it was -8 SFE, with a wind chill of -36 SFE. The coldest air Cincinnati had seen since January of 1994, when the river froze over. The city opened warming centers. Bethany House on Banning Road opened its overflow shelter. The Cincinnati Rescue Mission on Reading Road stayed open through the night. The Mill Creek Trail encampments, there were maybe 15 people there Marcus knew by name, largely emptied out by 8 p.m. on the 22nd, when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind came up. Most people went to shelters. A few didn't. Marcus had known it was coming for 4 days. He'd checked the weather at a library terminal, watched the forecast models, and spent the 20th, 21st, and 22nd working the wood stack. He cut, split, and stacked every piece of combustible material he'd been hoarding. He filled every gap in the stack, covering with flattened cardboard. He rechecked the stovepipe joints. He charged his phone, a prepaid track phone, at the library. He bought 3 fresh batteries for the CO detector at Dollar General. On the evening of the 22nd, with the temperature at 12 SF and falling, he loaded the stove for the first time with a full charge of dry hardwood, 4 pieces of 2x4 construction lumber, and 2 large chunks of oak from a tree branch that had come down in Norwood, and set the draft control to medium. Then he latched the antechamber panels down with tie wire and climbed inside the fermenter. He had 1 sleeping bag rated to 20 FF, a wool blanket he'd gotten from the St. Anthony Center's coat drive, a foam sleeping pad from a camping gear sale at Goodwill, his phone, the CO detector, a headlamp, a water bottle, and 2 protein bars. He set his phone alarm for every 3 hours so he could wake up, check the CO detector reading, and reload the stove if needed. At 10 p.m., the inside of the fermenter read 58 SF on a small thermometer he'd bought for $4 at a hardware store and stuck to the inner wall with a zip tie. Outside, 2 SF. He slept. 3 hours later, 1 a.m., December 23rd, he woke to the alarm. Outside temperature had dropped to -5 SF. Wind was screaming over the top of the machine shop, a sound he described later as less like wind and more like a truck engine with something wrong with it, a constant mechanical howl. He cracked the hatch, put on his jacket, went into the antechamber, and reloaded the stove. The fire had burned down to coals. He added 3 pieces of lumber, adjusted the draft, and watched the combustion come back up. 5 minutes, back inside. Interior temperature, 53 FF. The stove, a converted 40-gallon water heater with a fire brick floor and a jury-rigged flue collar held together partly with silicone, was keeping a 4-foot diameter steel cylinder at 53 FF on one of the coldest nights Cincinnati had seen in 30 years. At 4 a.m., -8 FF outside. Interior, 49 at FF. He added wood. At 7 a.m., -3 at FF outside. Interior, 54 at FF. The fire brick in the stove had fully saturated overnight. It held heat the way a cast iron pan holds heat, slowly and deeply, and was still radiating through the stove walls into the antechamber. The tank walls, for their part, were holding the interior temperature almost perfectly. 3-degree variation across 9 hours of a record cold night. He ate a protein bar. He looked at the thermometer for a while. He was warm enough that he'd pushed the wool blanket to one side and was just in the sleeping bag, partially unzipped. The storm lasted through December 25th. He stayed on Beekman Street through all of it. After the storm, word got around. Not publicly. There was no news story, no social media post, no outreach worker writing it up. Word got around the way it always gets around in those communities, which is person to person, slowly, with a lot of skepticism mixed in. Darius came back. He brought a man named Anthony, who'd been sleeping in a bus shelter on Spring Grove for 3 nights, and whose boots were soaked through and frozen. Marcus let him sleep in the antechamber, not in the fermenter, which was too small for 2 adults to sleep comfortably, and built the fire up high enough to warm the enclosed space. Anthony's boots were dry by morning. A woman from the Tender Mercies outreach team came by in early January, Lena, who Marcus had met at the Vine Street pantry a few times. She stood outside the chain-link gate and looked at the antechamber, the stovepipe sticking up, the wrapped flue joints, the CO detector visible through the open hatch. She asked a lot of practical questions, not skeptical exactly, more like she was doing an inventory. How did he source the wood? How often did the CO detector go off? Was the fermenter hatch accessible from outside if there was an emergency? She left and came back 2 weeks later with a propane-powered catalytic heater in a case, which she said was technically for someone else but that she wanted Marcus to look at as a backup heat source. He looked at it. He said the ventilation requirements on a catalytic heater were different from a wood stove, and he wasn't sure it was safer in the enclosed space. She respected that answer. In February of 2023, Lena connected Marcus with a caseworker at the Hamilton County Department of Job and Family Services who was working on a rapid rehousing referral. He got on the wait list for a unit through the Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority. He got a call in August of 2023. By November of 2023, he was in a studio apartment on Chase Avenue in Northside, paying rent with a combination of a housing voucher and wages from a new sheet metal job in Evandale that he'd found through a laborers' union referral Lena had set up. He took the CO detector with him when he moved out. Still has it. The tank is probably still on the concrete pad behind the Beekman Street building, or maybe it isn't. It was still there as of the last time anyone checked, which was the spring of 2023. The antechamber materials have mostly blown apart. The stovepipe is still up, which is how you can tell something happened there if you're standing at the fence. I want to be precise about what actually happened that winter, because I think it's easy to make this story into something it wasn't. Marcus didn't invent anything. The physics of an insulated container retaining heat is not a secret. The water heater wood stove has been in print since 1978. He read something once, remembered it, and applied it to a specific problem in a specific place at a specific time. He made a lot of small decisions correctly. The CO detector, the ventilation design, the draft control approach, the fire brick floor. He made one bad decision, overloading the stove with green wood in December, and the detector caught it. What he had that a lot of people in his situation don't have was 11 years of working with metal, which meant he knew what materials could and couldn't do. He knew foam was foam regardless of whether it was keeping beer cold or keeping a person warm. He knew a sealed steel vessel with a pressure relief fitting was already most of the way toward a firebox. He knew that 4-inch flue pipe needed to extend above the roofline or the draft would fail. He wasn't an engineer. He was a sheet metal worker who'd been laid off and who paid attention to how things worked. The storm on December 23rd was -8 FF outside and 49 FF at the coldest inside the tank. That's a 57-degree differential, held through the night, with no insulation between him and the outside air except a layer of polyurethane foam 2 to 3 inches thick and whatever the stove had loaded into the structure. For comparison, the National Weather Service's threshold for dangerous wind chill, the point at which frostbite begins to occur on exposed skin within 30 minutes, is -19 FF wind chill. That night's wind chill was -36 FF. At -36 FF, exposed skin develops frostbite in 10 minutes. The people in bus shelters and underpasses that night were at real risk. Several people in Cincinnati were hospitalized for cold-related illness between December 22nd and 25th. Marcus was warm enough to push his wool blanket aside. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. The brewery Fermenter sat in the Midwest Industrial Salvage Yard for about 3 weeks before Marcus found it. Gerald was going to cut it up that same week. Scrap steel, maybe $400 at the rate that month, maybe $500. The building it came from, a craft brewery in the Walnut Hills neighborhood that had closed in the summer of 2022, had already been stripped of everything worth selling. The Fermenter was the last piece. Between 2022 and 2024, more than 700 American craft breweries closed their doors. Most of their equipment went to auction or scrap. The fermenters, the bright tanks, the hot liquor tanks, stainless vessels with 2 to 3 inches of factory-applied polyurethane insulation, designed to hold temperature in a way that most residential wall construction doesn't even approach. Most of those tanks were cut up. Most of the people who could have used them were sleeping in bus shelters and underpasses. I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm not sure it has a clean answer. There are code issues and liability issues and property issues that make give abandoned brewery tanks to homeless people a harder sentence to finish than it sounds. But the physical reality is that on December 23, 2022, when the temperature in Cincinnati was -36 FF wind chill, a man who'd been sleeping outside for 14 months was warm enough to push his blanket aside, inside a vessel that cost $80 at scrap weight and probably would have been cut up the following Tuesday if he hadn't stopped to look at it. That's not an argument, that's just what happened. Marcus was back at a sheet metal job by November 2023. He still drives past that building on Beekman Street sometimes. He's not sure what he'd think if the tank was gone, cut up, melted down into something else. He said once that he hoped whoever owned the property eventually found it and wondered about the stovepipe sticking up through the antechamber roof. He said he hoped they at least noticed someone had been there.